There are some pieces of music that seem to be more than just the sum of their parts. As a music theory nerd, I love picking out different elements of a piece and figuring out what effect each has on the final product, but some tunes just have a vibe that seems to transcend all of the individual elements one could analyze. Rain from Halo 3 ODST is just such a piece. ODST was a massive shift in tone from the Halo status quo up to that point, trading the high-octane save-the-universe action for a more somber neo-noir style. The music carries a huge amount of the load of setting a tone for the game, with the track Rain standing out as a highlight example of creating a vibe that just soaks into your bones as you play. It mirrors the strange beauty of the empty streets illuminated only by neon lights and car fires, while evoking the deep sense of isolation that comes not just from making this journey alone, but from trying to make desperate contact with a crew that you're not even sure is still alive. There's a magic to the piece that may not be possible to fully analyze and explain. That being said, Rain is a perfect example to look at through the lens of how composers choose to voice their chords, in order to draw out a little more understanding of not just how to voice chords, but why one may voice a chord one way or another. Before that though, let's start at the ground floor. Voicing a chord is simply the process of deciding where each note in a chord is placed in relation to the other notes. If you think of a chord symbol as representing a pile of notes, then any different combination of these notes can be an expression of the same chord symbol, resulting in a huge variety of effects even within the same harmony. If each chord is its own color, then the voicing of the chord is like deciding on the exact shade. A voicing can have a particular effect for a number of reasons: which extensions are added onto the bass harmony, the amount of space between the top and bottom notes of the chord, what instruments are playing each note in the voicing, the list goes on. Primarily though, each different interval of space that you can have between two notes has its own distinct quality, and the nearly limitless combinations of different intervals inside one voicing can produce a nearly limitless range of subtle to not so subtle effects. You can group these intervals into three main categories: fourths and fifths, thirds and sixths, and seconds and sevenths. You may notice that the inversion of each interval, or flipping the order of the notes around, results in the other type of interval in that category. That's why they share a category. This doesn't mean that these pairs sound identical to each other, but each of these intervals share a kind of emotional quality with their partner. Fourths and fifths are both stark and open sounding. Fifths sound a little more open and free, while fourths sound a little more stark and cold. Thirds and sixths are both nice, but again the sixth sounds more open and generally more pretty in my humble opinion. Sevenths and seconds are the spicy ones, oftentimes used to add an edge to a chord voicing, especially the extra spicy major seventh or minor second. Rain uses primarily open fifths and seconds in its chord voicings, the exposed quality of a stack of fifths punctured by both major and minor seconds to create this wide open, lonely feeling, perfect for slinking through the abandoned streets of New Mombasa. We see this combination of intervals introduced in the very first chords of the piece. 4 big rolled open chords constructed of a fifth, a second, and then a stack of 2 fifths. This is a diatonic second, meaning that as the same interval structure moves down in thirds for each following chord, the second interval changes from a major second to a minor second to stay within the key of F minor. The exception, the final of the 4 chords, sees the introduction of a G-flat note. This introduces a questioning quality to the chord, adding the sharp edge of a minor second against the F below it, and maintaining the perfect fifth structure with the note above it. In a video detailing the start of his process writing this piece, composer Marty O'Donnell said that these chords were what I first thought of when thinking about Rain, and these chords are certainly evocative of that theme, but they also introduce the listener to the motifs of using fifths and seconds primarily, as well as foreshadowing the introduction of G-flat as a surprising resolution later on in the piece. After these chords, a solo alto saxophone brings us into the first main section of the piece with a 3-note continuation of our intervallic idea, a minor second down from A flat to G, followed by a leap down of a fifth. The first main section of the piece is a perfect showcase for how crucial voicing decisions can be when composing. This entire section is made up of two alternating chords, F minor and D flat. This is a common cinematic chord movement, but the way it's executed here is anything but common. We see the F minor chord expressed as an F minor 11 built on three pairs of fifths, F and C, E flat and B flat, and A flat and E flat. Combined, the voicing is a fifth followed by a third, a fourth, a second, and another fourth, but the way this voicing is split into these three chunks really brings out the quality of the fifth interval. Already you can hear how different this approach sounds from just a regular F minor chord or even an F minor 11 in a more closed voicing. The following D-flat chord starts similarly with this straight stack of fifths, but then it leaps up to hit a major 7th interval with a G above an A-flat. The dissonance of this major 7th is potent, but also the G here is the sharp 11th over the D-flat chord, also known as the money note. The sharp 11th is an infamously colorful choice of chord extension, and it only occurs diatonically over the flat 6 chord in a minor key or the 4 chord in a major key. The opportunity to use this intensely emotional chord extension without breaking the fourth wall with the listener by stepping outside of the home key of the piece is too good to pass up. Rain makes the most of this opportunity by leaning heavily on this note every single time a D-flat chord shows up in the piece. In the 7th bar of this section, the F minor chord is voiced slightly differently from usual. The E flat in the middle of the voicing is lowered to a D flat, giving a crunchy minor 2nd interval against the C below it. With this small adjustment, the sound of the chord is completely changed, and this crunch comes at the perfect point in the music, just as your ears think they have this tune pegged. We've heard this colorfully voiced F minor to D flat progression 3 times so far, and our ears are expecting a 4th time to round us out. The chord you expect almost comes, but with the added minor 2nd giving a sharp punch to the gut along with it. The following section of the piece introduces a different take on the rain motif, this time a flowing, rolling 16th note part in the piano and strings. While this is a stream of single 16th notes, they add up to imply a specific chord voicing the same way that playing any arpeggio of a chord implies that specific chord. This time the theme of fifths and seconds is elaborated upon as we get the stack of 2 fifths with a minor 2nd on top, making a beautifully tragic sounding F minor add 2 chord. If the previous section was about evoking the loneliness of the player's situation, this voicing, along with the soaring string melody, captures the tragedy of it. Sticking to the same underlying F minor to D flat harmony, these D flat chords are voiced similarly but not quite the same as our F minor add 2s. Rather than a stack of fifths with a 2nd on top, we get a 5th, a jump up of a 6th to hit the 3rd of the chord, and then a major 2nd on top. While maintaining the same voicing structure between the 2 chords would work, it would lose out on the chance to hit that sweet, sweet sharp 11th over top of the D flat chord. Compare it with this D flat add 2 version that mimics the previous F minor chord's voicing. The add to version is just too consonant, too hopeful sounding for this part of the piece. Using the sharp 11th of the chord provides a tension that, along with the F minor add 2 chord before it, keeps the player emotionally devastated. The following short transition section introduces a new, simple type of voicing that I think should be in every composer's tool belt, a triad with the third raised up an octave. This simple change from a basic triad gives the exact same chord a much more mature sound, as the interval structure changes from a simple stack of thirds to an open fifth mixed with a beautiful sixth. This voicing was a favorite of Bach's, used frequently throughout his works, and adopted by Chopin and other Bach devotees as a go-to voicing for triads. Here, it's used to contrast the poignant dissonance of the previous section by taking out the colorful seconds and sharp 11ths and giving us just the straight tonic triad. This section is the turning point, where a glimmer of hope is introduced for the listener. As we move from this open F minor triad with an added C melody note on top to a bright stack of fifths built off of G flat, the C on top holds over as a suspension above this G flat chord, squeezing out more sweet, sweet sharp 11th juice, while the D flat and A flat underneath move up to an E flat and B flat. Once again, we see a full, lush chord voicing broken up into groups of fifths to evoke that interval's particular sparse sound. While it was subtly hinted at in the piece's intro, moving to G-flat here is really preparing the listener for a bigger modulation to come. And while the flat 2 chord in a minor key can sound extremely dark, using this bright open 5th voicing and the sharp 11th on top brings out instead a hopeful feeling. After this chord movement is completed a second time, our original 3-note saxophone theme comes back in to usher in the next section. A common compositional technique used throughout the Halo soundtracks is a 2-part bass and melody kind of approach, where the music is stripped down to just 2 voices that move independently of one another, hinting at an underlying harmony without explicitly laying it out. This gives the music a stoic quality that can sound more intense than a full chord progression at times, but it also gives the music room to grow if need be, as other instruments can be added in as needed to flesh out the harmony and build intensity. In the following section of Rain, a low melody and dotted quarter note counterline interact above a droning bass pedal, contrasting the full voiced chords that directly preceded it. This is the opposite of using a cool, elaborate chord voicing, but it can still teach us about how to voice chords. A key concept in the process of voicing chords is voice leading, or looking at how each note in a chord moves to the notes in the chord before and after it. Smooth voice leading, where each note moves in a logical and pleasing way from one chord to the other, can bring life to a chord progression and even allow for the use of some pretty out there harmonies that might sound too jarring or disjointed if used improperly. To understand voice leading, you have to be able to think of each note in a chord as being a single voice, playing through its own melody as it weaves through a chord progression, which is exactly what's happening here. The melody and counter melody here both make total sense on their own, but when layered together, the interplay of intervals between the 2 lines create a series of different colors. The dark beauty of the 6th in the first 2 bars bring a new mood to this section of the piece. The D natural note in the counterline makes perfect sense within the shape of the line and allows for a cool color shift that would sound too jarring if it wasn't used so smoothly. And the moving counterline over this D flat pedal colorfully elaborates what would otherwise be a completely static 2 bars. This idea continues but grows as we make another surprise move to G flat, acting as a pivot chord that sets up a modulation to the key of E flat minor. In this section, the emotional climax of the piece, the high strings drive a heartfelt melody over top of a C flat to E flat minor progression. The harmony is laid out strongly in power chord voicings, voicings based on stacking the root, fifth, and another root of the chord. Most widely used in a rock setting, these kinds of voicings provide a grit and power that drives the music forward, bringing the piece up to its peak of intensity. The dotted quarter note counterline concept from just before is maintained as well. The top note of each power chord fills out the chord progression by creating a sort of countermelody, moving to adjacent notes and smoothing out the transition from chord to chord with logical melodic movement. This creates smoother voice leading between each chord, of course, but also allows for moments of added tension, with the addition of tense and colorful chord extensions that make sense as part of the counterline's melodic trajectory. I particularly like this walk up from the root to the second to the third of the E-flat minor chord, and how the resolution up to the root of the following C-flat chord is delayed by landing on the colorful major seventh of the chord on beat 1. An incredibly graceful modulation from the key of E-flat minor back to our initial key of F minor comes next. The E-flat minor section ends on an A-flat sus2 chord, once again a stack of fifths in the piano, with the piano also slowly walking down from the fifth to the fourth to the major third on top. The major 4 chord is a super common way of brightening up a minor key piece, so ending on it like this gives this emotional section a hopeful turn at the end. This A-flat is also a pivot chord though, smoothly dropping us off on its relative minor chord of F minor, and just like that, we're back to our F minor to D-flat vamp, in a repetition of our opening piano part with the addition of alto sax solo on top. The departure of the lush string section leaves the final part of the piece feeling cold in comparison, with the move to solo saxophone giving off a sense of loneliness that brings us back to the main theme, the main goal of the piece. It feels like the previous sections were inside the player's head. You're worrying about your squad mates, the severity of the situation getting to you, ending off on a feeling of hope as you decide to keep charging on through the dark streets of New Mombasa, only to snap out of it and come back to the reality of walking alone in the rain. As the saxophone plays its 3-note motif one last time, the piano ends on a stack of fifths, followed by the very first chord that opened the piece. Huge thanks to patron Dennis Antonov for the request. Halo's soundtracks are so iconic and have been overly neglected on this channel for too long. Hopefully I can make more Halo music videos in the future, but considering I only made it through one song for this one, it might take a little while. You can join Dennis in supporting the channel by checking out my Patreon here or follow me on Twitter at 8BitMusicTheory. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.